I was joined just a few moments ago by the Finance Minister, Matthias Cormann, from Canberra. Matthias Cormann, welcome back to ViewPoint.
Good to be back.
Look, when the Prime Minister announced his new reforms to the GST, his new plan of GST reform in Perth on the weekend, presumably you were in the room.
I was, yes.
Was that the first you'd heard of this plan?
Well, no, I mean, this has been something that's been on the table for some time. The Australian government has long been of the view that WA's share of the GST is at 30% is inappropriately low. That's why over the past 2 years, in 2015 and in 2016, the Commonwealth has made additional payments to WA in the order of about 499 million and 490 million in those 2 years, additional investments into WA infrastructure, effectively to stop the drop in WA's GST payments at 37% from falling further down to 30%.
Exactly.
Back in 2000.
Yeah, that's been going on for a while. But was that speech and the Prime Minister's announcement that he was going to look at some reform in this area now in this government, was that the first you'd heard of this re-elected government going down this path?
Well, sorry, like if you let me finish the answer to your first question.
Okay.
So the additional payment by the Commonwealth was always a short-term solution. We always said that there would need to be a medium to long-term or structural fix. And indeed, all the way back in April 2015, the concept of putting in a floor below which individual states share the GST cannot fall has first been put to the Council of the Australian Governments, and indeed it was also discussed at their retreat in July 2015. So it's something that's been on the table for a while, and you know, essentially the reason this is coming up now is because it's clear now that as a result of continuing lower iron ore prices, the WA share of the GST under the current system and in the ordinary course of events will start to increase again in future years. And this is the most appropriate time to pursue a floor. Once WA exceeds a particular threshold, putting in a floor below which no state can fall when it comes to their share of the GST will help ensure that no other state is going to be any worse off because you know, it wouldn't mean any reductions in projected GST payments to any individual state at that point in time.
Okay, then since the election, the Cabinet has met and decided to go down this reform path.
Look, I'm not going to go through the internal processes of government. I mean, you know that. I mean, this has been something that's been on the table for a long time. The Prime Minister made a relevant announcement on Saturday. I was well aware of it beforehand. When indeed this is something that's been part of an ongoing conversation that the Commonwealth, of course, has been involved in.
Well, what I'm getting at is, as you'd be aware, is whether, of course, this issue's been around and the need to address it has been around for a long time, certainly preceding this election and the one before it. But did the Prime Minister just announce this reform out of the blue on Saturday, and Cabinet is now, the Treasurer, yourself as Finance Minister and Cabinet's going to need to get its head around exactly how to proceed?
Well, I've just told you that this is an issue that actually was put by the Australian Government to state and territory governments in the Council of Australian Government back in April, Australian governments back in April 2015. It was put back there in July 2015 in the context of the Council of Australian Governments retreat at that time, and you know, this is now being pushed ahead, and the Prime Minister has picked the appropriate time to push it ahead because we now know that Western Australia's share of GST is going to increase in the ordinary course of events, and this is the appropriate time to ensure that what has happened in the West Australian context is not going to happen to any other state down the track. I mean, you've got to remember the GST was put in place as a growth revenue for state and territory governments, a reliable growth revenue to help and to help ensure that individual states and territories have got the necessary resources to sustainably fund health and school and law and order related services and other important services provided by state and territory governments. Now, obviously, horizontal fiscal equalisation is a very important principle. It's very appropriate for stronger states to help support those states in need of support. But the question is really a question of balance. Where does it go where does this level of cross, I guess, support, cross-jurisdictional support, go a little bit too far? And the government's view, the federal government's view, is that 30 cents in a dollar is not an appropriate level of return when it comes to the GST for any individual state.
Yeah, it's about sharing the tax revenue around more fairly. As you say, Western Australia quite rightly says 30% of the GST raised in their state is not enough. No one really envisaged it going down that low. I'm told no other state has dropped below 80%. But of course,
80,
other states are already arcing up. Other states are rejecting this. They'll try and thwart change. You'd have to concede that reform in this area is exceedingly difficult, if not impossible.
Well, the Prime Minister said on Saturday that he expected this reform would be politically difficult. I mean, of course, I mean, we're not naive in relation to this, but we would just put again, we would just put the question. I mean, is it fair for any individual state to get back just less than 30%, 30 cents, well, less than a third of what is raised in that particular state by way of GST? Is it fair for any state to get less than a third back in order to fund or help fund the important service that state provides, when this was a revenue source that was meant to provide a reliable growth revenue to help fund their services in a sustainable fashion? So,
but any boost on the projections to what Western Australia or any other state can keep necessarily means that other states will get less. So obviously those so-called mendicant states, the states that always are subsidised by the other states, particularly South Australia and Tasmania, are going to resist this every inch of the way.
Well, I mean, obviously there's no proposal to make any adjustment now and to establish a floor that is above what Western Australia is getting now by way of share of the GST. That is why the Commonwealth at this point has made unilateral Commonwealth grants in order to, essentially stop the drop in GST payments to Western Australia. What the proposal here is to establish a floor below the threshold that Western Australia is expected to reach in the future, so that what you've just suggested doesn't happen. I mean, at that point in time, there will be projected GST revenues for all states, and by putting in a floor below WA's share of the GST at that point in time, when they have exceeded that threshold, it means that no other state will be worse off. No money would be taken away from any other state. But I mean, it was, as you say, it was never envisaged that any state would ever find themselves in a circumstance where they would get back less than a third of the GST raised in their jurisdiction, and that is, of course, the situation that Western Australia is in now.
You're right.
It wouldn't be fair for any state to be in that situation.
No, you're right. It sounds like sensible reform, but you're wrong in that you say no state will be worse off. You're saying that they'll still get the projected growth that you're going to budget for, but if you didn't have that floor, then there would obviously be more money around to share in certain circumstances, and so those states are going to be very unwilling to sign off on it.
Well, you're making an assumption to what is likely to happen to iron ore prices and all sorts of things. I mean, like what we're saying, this is really just putting in an insurance that should have been in place right from the start.
Yep.
If it had been known at the time that this was a risk that could happen, that one state could end up getting less than a third of their GST back, I suspect that states wouldn't have signed up to the system then. States would have said at the time that there should be a floor. I mean, everybody supports, everybody reasonable supports horizontal fiscal equalisation. Everybody reasonable supports the principle of stronger supports, supporting those states in need of support. But the question is, how far can this or should this reasonably go? Is it appropriate for there to be a limit to how low an individual state's share of the GST can go? And this is, I mean, the Prime Minister has indicated on Saturday that he will work to ensure that there is an appropriate floor put in place, and of course that will now involve further conversations with state and territory premiers and chief ministers.
If I could just ask you about something outside your portfolio, although it's kind of related, and that is the census this year and the stuff-ups. Are you concerned that with less than half of people so far responding and completing the census, are you concerned that the whole project could have to be scrapped this year and started again later in the year or next year?
No, I'm not. And people, of course, still have, depending on whether they fill in their census online or by paper, until the 18th or the 23rd of September before they need to have completed their census. And there'll be some further communications from the relevant minister in the next little while to keep reminding people of their responsibility to complete the census by that time. But I mean, there's still a few weeks to go, so we're quite confident that this will be able to be achieved.
There must be a point, though, at which the data is useless. If you only get 50% of households responding, obviously it wouldn't be worth much chop. But there must be a target, whether it's 80%, 90%, 99%. There must be a point at which the census won't deliver to the government the value that you expect.
Well, look, this is a question outside of my portfolio. It's also a hypothetical question. From where we sit, we're confident that this census will be completed in the appropriate fashion, and people have until the 18th or the 23rd of September, depending on whether they'll fill it in online or by paper. And we, of course, would ask everyone that hasn't yet completed their census to do so at the earliest opportunity.
All right, then I'm not going to ask you about the Banking Royal Commission. We know you don't want to see that. You've got this committee process in place. But let me ask you about one other issue that's come up today, slightly out of left field, a little bit of toilet humour involved here. But Pauline Hanson is upset that the Australian Tax Office in one of their buildings is putting in squat toilets. She says that we're surrendering, I suppose, to overseas cultures rather than forcing people to adopt the lavatory style we tend to use. Does she have a point, or is this the sort of distraction you don't want to hear and you're going to be forced to listen to for as long as she's in the Senate?
Well, I got to admit, I hadn't sort of turned my mind to the lavatory arrangements of the Australian Taxation Office, but I'm pretty relaxed. I mean, if this responds to a need within the Australian Taxation Office, I understand that they've got a very diverse, multiculturally diverse workforce. I'm pretty relaxed about it.
I'm pretty relaxed. I just don't know where we're going to go the next couple of years. Matthias Cormann, it's the last thing I expected to be talking to the Finance Minister about. But thanks for joining us again on ViewPoint.
Always good to talk to you.